Carol Off, of course, a journalist who has covered politics in Canada and abroad for many years, and of course, currently the host of As It Happens on CBC Radio 1. Carol Off.
It's a good, lively crowd, I can tell. But I am worried there is alcohol here. Is anyone in a drunken stupor? Someone back there? You're in a drunken stupor? Oh, you're in a drunken stupor, too. Okay. Just we need to know. We need to know who's in a drunken stupor because there is a video being made and you... Yeah, right there, you see. So just be very careful in your drunken stupor to avoid that. But then you won't remember it anyways. You might want the video to remind you of what you did when you were in the drunken stupor. I mean, I gotta stop. I just gotta stop. It's too much fun. Joe Clark, the opposite of this, which we discussed. Joe Clark served as Canada's 16th Prime Minister starting in June of 1979. He was in that office for 9 months. Though it was short, it was glorious from a political point of view. He led the only party to defeat Pierre Elliott Trudeau in an election, ending 16 years of continuous Liberal rule. He's also the youngest person to have ever been the Prime Minister of Canada. He took office the day before he turned 40. The shortest reign as Prime Minister, but the longest tenure as the Minister of Foreign or External Affairs. The issues he put his steady hand to are too numerous to mention. On the international stage, there was the Tehran hostage crisis, South African apartheid, the Vietnamese boat people. Domestically, the Constitution, the Quebec separatist movement, free trade. And I believe he was the first federal politician to call for the decriminalization of marijuana. So he trumped those Trudeaus on all fronts. Beyond all that, Mr. Clark is highly valued and praised for his work as a statesman, for his diplomatic deftness, for his grasp of world affairs, for his writing, his teaching, and for being just an all-around great guy. Please welcome the Right Honourable Joe Clark.
Oh, you sink into these chairs, don't you?
You're okay, aren't you? You're not in a drunken stupor.
Well, let's see.
Yeah, we should see. Who knows? Maybe it's a wonderful state to be in. I think. I can't remember.
I thought this was going to be about me.
It is about you. The antidote. You know, the last time that I spoke with you on stage was about 2 years ago. And you said something at that time, the very end of it was a long session, a lot of people were on stage, and you said something at the very end that has haunted me for 2 years. You said at the end that I don't recognize this country anymore. And I wanted for 2 years to come back and ask you to say what you mean, until I read this book and I realized you totally and completely understand this country and what's happened to it. But in what ways is Canada unrecognizable to you today?
Well, part of the reason I wrote the book was because I believe that the country that I knew and esteem can be encouraged back. And I hope that well beyond the reading of the book, there will be a lot of discussion of the elements that I put forward. First of all, we are not an accidental country. We're a deliberate country. People built this country. And not only physically, but in terms of the social structure and the other attributes that we have. And that indicates that we have to keep on building. We cannot take the country for granted. The great risk, it seems to me, is that we are so fortunate that we can take all of this for granted. We can retreat into our silos. And what's curious to me is that for the last several years, there has not been an impulse to try to engage Canadians in discussion of their country. And naturally, when that happens, we retreat into our silos. Albertans become more Albertan. The same with Quebecois, the same with others. And I think we need to assert again a sense of what the country can become. When I said I didn't recognize it, that's true. I saw manifestations that I thought did not reflect the country that I knew. But I've come to the view that that country, in fact, is there. It is latent. It can be brought out. A great worry now is not so much that people who were engaged have drawn back, but that there are not very many models for younger Canadians, or indeed for new Canadians, people who have come here trying to look for an identification of what country it was they joined. And you can't do that, won't happen passively. That requires an active articulation of what we are about, what our goals are.
But you could have written at this point in your life, and with this incredible career you've had, the incredible stories you have to tell, and there are some wonderful anecdotes in this, you could have written a memoir. You could have written something about just about your achievements and everything. And we haven't ID'd the book, which I think is important, How We Lead Canada in a Century of Change. You set out to show, it's almost a manifesto. It's a manifesto demanding that we re-examine, we go back to exactly what you just said, to go back to first principles and concern ourselves with the direction this country is going in, all of us. It is a cri de coeur.
It also requires, I think, examining who we have been. And it's interesting. I'm sure this happens with anyone who writes. You learn things as you go. I went into this venture with really some false impressions about Canada's international history, really prior to the Second World War. And I learned a lot about that. I learned that we, in fact, probably did not have what could be called a golden age. We had extraordinary accomplishment, but it had to do with some quite deliberate factors, some of which I see recurring. Can I go back over history for just a second? First of all, the Fathers of Confederation had no idea this was going to be an international country. That wasn't their purpose. They were interested in a domestic arrangement. And we fought valiantly, at least valiantly, in the First World War and won a place at the table, but we were not really an international country at that time. In the late 1930s, we began to develop some very talented people, drawing them into the federal public service, particularly the Department of External Affairs. And they were worldly, wanted to be more worldly. The Prime Minister at the time, Mr. King, was very concerned about internal tensions in the country. He didn't want international engagements because he thought that would bring new tensions into our country. So he kept those people in check. Then the Second World War came. We became involved in that war. And because we were involved in the war, we had to have diplomatic posts at countries that were our allies. So we took these bright young men, they were all men then, and sent them out to international posts a long way from Ottawa. They were operating on their own. They had independence. They had contexts they'd never seen before. They became even more worldly. They came back to a world that had just ended war, and to a government where Mr. King, for all of his faults, knew he wasn't going to be there forever, and he was looking for a successor. With no eye at all on international matters, he chose Louis Saint Laurent, because Saint Laurent had been a very strong francophone in his government. And Saint Laurent became the foreign minister because it was a means of bringing him up in the ranks. And it turned out that Saint Laurent did not share Mr. King's concerns about the internal divisions of the country, nor did he share his reluctance about the world. On the contrary, the issue arose about Canada's role with regard to UN action in Korea. Mr. King said no. Mr. Saint Laurent said, if it's no, I'm leaving. Mr. King said, it's yes. And there was a new foreign minister. And he was a foreign minister who encouraged the natural instincts of this group of people who came along. Now, obviously they included Lester Pearson. Obviously that included the work that was done on the United Nations. But a Vancouver guy, diplomat, named Dana Wilgress was the first chairman of the international trade, of the group that set up the World Trade Organization. Mr. Pearson, again, was an architect of NATO. We played a very major role in the development of the post-war years. Now, we did that not from nothing, but we did that without any sort of history or sense of antecedents. I think we're in another new world now, a world that in its way is as new as the 1945 world was after the post-war, after the war. And it's new for two principal reasons. One is that the end of the Cold War meant that the impact on conflict of ideology began to recede. And what we're dealing with now is a world in which conflict, to a greater degree than before, is driven by cultural differences. And when one looks at Canada, with all the modesty we can summon, we are nonetheless better at any country than any country in the world at managing diversity, at dealing with cultural diversity. So that here is a need in the world, and here is a capacity in Canada. The other thing that happened then, interestingly, they happened in a 12-month period, the end of the Cold War, and the development, the commercialization of the internet. And the internet just absolutely changed the world. It brought in people who were outsiders before. And we see that dramatically now. We see it in the Arab Spring. We see it in the aspiration of people in far-off countries that we thought were not going to ever rise above the bottom of the pyramid. It's just a profoundly different world, and one that is much harder to manage. There aren't superpowers anymore. There aren't going to be. There's not going to be people who are giving orders one way or another to everyone else. So again, there needs to be some capacity to draw these forces together.
But you describe Canada and its capacity to do these
Yep.
things, and you explain how this idea of a soft power and the influence we had because of Saint Laurent and others who had this international view. And then we come to 2006, when you say that we lost that sense of our capacity. What happened in 2006?
I'm a bit of a prejudiced witness on this, but here's what I think happened.
Election?
Well, there was an election, but more than that, I mean, a lot of things happened on the way to that election. One of the things that's very interesting, and remember, I speak as someone who grew up in a national political party. Most of what I learned about the country was from a national political party. That's where I learned about the French fact. There was not a lot of French fact in High River when I was growing up. And that's where I learned about a number of things. And I make the point in the book that one of the reasons that the government I was privileged to be part of took such an active role in the fight against apartheid was that Brian Mulroney and I were 23-year-old progressive conservatives standing in the Chateau Laurier when John Diefenbaker came back from a Commonwealth conference where he had led the fight against apartheid. It was part of our legacy. This new government, whatever its strengths or weaknesses, is a new party. It was a party for less than 2 years before it became a government.
It's not the Progressive Conservative Party in any way?
But it's not, well, it has members who were formed in the Progressive Conservative Party and whose traditions are there, and but it is not, the sense of history that I grew up with has been, I think expunged is not too strong a word. It's certainly not referred to directly by the present party. But the real point is what it is and what it isn't. That's not what the point is. The real point is that it came really without any history, without any formation. It had some attitudes, it had some goals that it wanted to accomplish. Some of them struck a large resonance with Canadians. Like most elections, like the one I won, it was an election about who people wanted to get rid of in 2006, rather than who people wanted to embrace. But they came to office, and people sort of assumed that because other parties had some sense of history or connection with the past, this one would too. It doesn't. But in addition to that, I think there are some very prominent figures in the government who regard themselves as outsiders. And they regard themselves as outsiders even though they're inside. And those attitudes mean that they are going to be very skeptical about institutions, which most of us have regarded. I think those have regarded as valuable. I think those two factors have come together to create a government that was outside the tradition of most of the Canadian governments that we've seen since the Second World War.
You describe Stephen Harper's government. He said Stephen Harper leads a private interest government in a public interest country.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think a lot of us have tried to figure out what is it about this government and what is it about this country. And I think...
What does that mean, though? Describe what that...
Well, a public interest country is one that, that puts issues larger than yourself ahead of what we're looking for. Indeed, ahead of your region. And we have always been that, not just in our social programs, but in most of the things we've tried to do as a nation. A private interest government is one that has a list of things it wants to accomplish, and those are really all it focuses on. And if there are other people with other goals or other formations or other attitudes, you could just steam by them. And I think by and large, with obviously some exceptions, the government has been crafted from a range of of backgrounds, but the party as such, the direction of the government, it seems to me, is one that is attracted to very specific goals they want to achieve. Most of them are goals that would be called hard power goals. Some would apply some less flattering language to some of the things they want to do. But it is not the broad view of the national interest that was there in other governments.
A large part of the book, or I'd say probably the majority of the book, you go through the various extremely important foreign initiatives and foreign roles that Canada played and how that's changed. And significantly, I want to start with the Middle East because you played a large role there. You admit that you made mistakes yourself in your Middle East policy. But what mistakes is Stephen Harper's government making in our relationship with Israel now? He's
focusing far too narrowly on one of the critically important players. And I quote Mr. Baird, the foreign minister, as saying, I'd quote two people who have conservative credentials. One is Robert Stanfield, who talked about when he bailed me out of trouble on the mistake I made as Prime Minister. He carried out a study and he talked about the importance of a balanced approach that would be seen by all principal sides as being fair.
You learned the hard way, and you knew
what
it meant to keep that balance.
But that was the Stanfield doctrine that I think has now, by and large, become the Canadian doctrine. He articulated a policy that subsequent governments followed. Mr. Baird, understandably, I know where he's coming from, but he says, we are not a referee. We have a side in the Middle East. Well, the great majority of Canadians, and certainly the people I know in Parliament, are very strong defenders of the right to exist of Israel and very much interested in the success and thriving of Israel. But we recognize that there is more to the Middle East than one country, and we have worked very hard to try to develop that balanced approach elsewhere. I don't think this government is preoccupied with that. It regards itself as having a side.
What did you think when John Baird closed the Canadian embassy in Tehran?
I still don't understand why it was done, but I think it was a serious mistake. I think it's generally a serious mistake to close down relations with other people. We have to know what's going on there. It occurred to me today in the course of an interview somewhere else, an experience I had in Tehran just before I became constitutional minister. I was meeting with the senior leaders of the government. I was Canadian foreign minister. I was getting answers I didn't quite understand. I befriended the foreign minister. At the end of this rather puzzling interview, he said, let's go for a walk. So out we went, and we went into this huge space, no buildings around, trees, but not trees that would hide microphones. And he said, here we can talk. Here's what we were trying to say to you. And that's what a diplomat does when they're on the ground. A foreign minister does it in extraordinary circumstances. But a diplomat on the ground learns these things, develops confidences, develops understandings. If you're sitting in a crowded street, or if you're forced to ride around a city in an armored car, you notice things that you wouldn't notice if you were reading communiques in Ottawa or in Toronto. So you pick these things up, and they're very valuable to you. They let you come to judgments about what can be done. They also build relationships. So on the off chance that someone, in this example, Iran, wants to take a calculated risk about policy A, B, or C, they want to talk to somebody from the other side, if you will, from the West, but not necessarily the British, not necessarily the United States. So the odds are they would talk to a couple of others, but also to Canadians. And we would then be in a position, not on a huge issue, but on the tone that might be taken on an important question as to what tone might be offered. You can't do that if you're not there.
But how can he possibly play that role? How could John Baird or Canada play that role in Tehran, given that they have said, and Benjamin Netanyahu has agreed, that Canada is the best friend of Israel? How could they possibly play that role? Does it make sense to even have an embassy in Tehran that is going to have that kind of influence when you have shown your cards like that?
Let me answer with a parallel. We were very active in the fight against apartheid. Prior to Canada hosting the Commonwealth Conference here in Vancouver all those years ago, I sought an invitation with approval of other Commonwealth countries to go to South Africa. They knew where I stood on apartheid. They nonetheless, I won't really say they welcomed me. Bill Chambers was with me. He'll remember there wasn't exactly a warm welcome, but we were received there, and we had conversations about where openings might be, what might happen. So no matter how strong your public positions are, if you send people to a place, you can nonetheless have those conversations. In fact, it may be that people would be more interested to you if they think you're very much a hardliner. They want to see where your limits are. They want to know how you assess something they might do. I don't recommend that Canada go to Iran as a hardliner, but I do think Canada should go to Iran.
But they would have then also the ability to, because they are best friends with Israel, then that's an opportunity, isn't it? I mean,
That's
you
a
can
great
actually
opportunity.
you can actually influence things.
Well,
Hey, you're my friend. I'm going to tell you, you got to stop rattling the saber here.
Well, and precisely, if there were a Canadian ambassador in Tehran, and they'd have to be pretty good, but most of our ambassadors are, the great majority are pretty good. If they were there and someone wanted to get a message to the Israelis that they did not want to deliver directly, we would be an ideal conduit for that kind of conversation. It's just
That's lost to us now.
well, it's going to be. I learned after we closed, as you know, an embassy in Iran was closed because of actions I took, and it took a long time to open it up again. So it'll take a while to get that open again. But
I thought the Americans did all that. I watched this film called Argo. I don't remember you playing a role in this at all. Can I just say, I love this, and there's a story, I don't know if this is, how well known this is, but this story you have in the book about how you couldn't decide whether it should be a group of filmmakers who would smuggle out the Americans or some agricultural experts from Guelph. And I was picturing Ben Affleck being a sort of, like a dairy farmer from Guelph trying to smuggle. I mean, it's a wonderful thing. I really regret that they weren't agricultural experts from Guelph.
remember that there's the Ontario Agricultural College is at Guelph. So there you are. It's not entirely. We're not talking about downtown metropolitan Guelph here.
I didn't mention before we began, but this is being recorded, and we're going to play a large part of this conversation on As It Happens.
I'm in trouble in Guelph.
Thought I should tell you that now. But I'll just do a little ID so our listeners, As It Happens listeners, will know where we are. I'm on stage at the Appel Salon at the Toronto Reference Library. I'm with the Right Honourable Joe Clark, former Prime Minister of Canada, and we're talking about his book, How We Lead Canada in a Century of Change. All right, I'm going to move on to the rap sheet here and go on to the United Nations. And you say in your book you think that Canada has thumbed its nose at the United Nations. Stephen Harper says he supports the UN. He's not withdrawing funding. He's the world's best friend. What do you think we are doing with the United Nations?
We're not treating it seriously. We can't get out, so we stay. But we're not treating it seriously. The Prime Minister doesn't go and engage there. When Mr. Baird goes, more often it's to lecture people than to engage with them.
But Stephen Harper does go to New York, and I don't know. You think he goes to Starbucks across the street, and or something?
But they do not take. They don't believe in palaver. They've come to the view that these are talk shops and that they're not very useful. And I wouldn't be surprised if they have something of a similar view to the Commonwealth and maybe to La Francophonie and other organizations. They're not instinctive multilateralists. They're not multilateralists domestically. When was the last time we had a federal provincial conference, which is multilateralism at home, a First Ministers' Conference? It's been a long time, years, decades, not decades, a long time. And so they're not natural multilateralists. And that's partly because they think there's a lot of talk that wastes time, and you have to put up with people with these outlandish views that are different from your own. Well, that's life. I'm making light of this. It's a very serious principle. We have to be involved with people who are not like us in a world that is increasingly not like us and where we have points to make and things to learn.
John Baird says he describes the United Nations as a place of endless, fruitless, inward-looking exercises, procedure and process over substance and results. But then he points out that this is, and there is truth to that. I mean, there are people who have serious problems with the United Nations just jawing all this discussion about what's going on in Syria, while Bashar al-Assad continues to,
Absolutely.
engage in a bloodbath of his own people. So there's a lot of support for it. And John Baird says he describes the UN Human Rights Council as a debating club for dictators.
So what's the alternative? That's the question one has to deal with. The United Nations is far from perfect. It's always been far from perfect. And sometimes it is able to come through, sometimes by deft timing or fancy footwork, but it is better than anything else. And the United Nations, remember, is not just the place where people debate. It's also this extraordinarily successful family of United Nations organizations that have made a profound change in the world. The government really doesn't, the Harper government doesn't really contest that, I don't think. They make contributions to those organizations. But it is the palaver aspect that they turn away from. And you just, there may well be a line between deciding that there is 60% of the world or 55% of the world you're not going to bother engaging with, and a political party that says there's 55% of the electorate you're not going to engage with domestically. I mean, they are accustomed to focusing on a fairly narrow range and operating within that range. It's worked for them politically for a while. It's not helpful for Canada, and it's internationally, and it's not the way to acquire the kind of influence that we could have internationally.
Is there nothing principled in the Stephen Harper decision to boycott the Commonwealth Games, the Commonwealth Conference in Sri Lanka?
You're doing the same
Here we
thing,
go. Yeah,
Commonwealth Games.
Or the Olympic Games. I'm in a stupor, so I don't really know. I warned you.
Yeah.
But Stephen Harper refused to attend the Commonwealth Conference in Sri Lanka. He says that this is a country of human rights abuses. Isn't that a principled stand to take?
It is, but the point of principles is to do something about them. You have to have them, but you have to act on them. And you can't act on them if you stay away. We're not going to change behavior in Sri Lanka by lecturing them or by saying, I don't like you so much, I'm not coming. One has to engage in these questions. These are not new debates. Again, to go back to South Africa, we faced very serious pressure to shut down our embassy quite early on. And in fact, there were some pressures by serious people that would have had us shut down our embassy before Mr. Mandela was freed. Our embassy on the ground was able to do a lot because it was there. And I think principles are essential to public life, but you can't simply articulate them. You have to then do something about it.
You called it megaphone diplomacy.
Yeah, I quoted Peter Carrington on that, but so just to give him a footnote of credit, but that's what it is. And it also is, as I've said in the book, it indicates an instinct for the podium, making a point, rather than from the playing field where you can make a difference.
We often discuss the environment as domestically, but there's very important, climate change is an international issue. No one can be functioning alone on how to deal with this huge problem that we're facing. The Kyoto Accord, Canada is the first signatory of Kyoto to withdraw. But was Kyoto not unrealistic?
I think that Canada rushed to sign Kyoto for not very sensible reasons, in fact. The Prime Minister at the time said that we wanted to be there before the Americans. And so Kyoto had unrealistic elements, but nonetheless, it was the basis upon which international action on the climate was being premised. And I believe, could have made it work.
But at the same time, we just heard last week that, in fact, the new goals that were established by the Harper government will not just not be reached, but almost by a fraction of what they anticipated or said they would do as far as reducing CO2 emissions in the environment.
I think that there are a few countries for whom sound environmental policy is more important than Canada. We're going to be affected by climate change more than most of the world. It's going to be hard for us because the adjustments are going to be hard. But because it's hard doesn't mean that we sort of step back from it. We have to engage it. And it's going to be, I think, very difficult, but it has to be engaged. For a while, because we were early starters on environmental issues, we had the advantage of sort of a benefit of the doubt. It was a Canadian, Maurice Strong, who chaired the first conference, Mr. Mulroney, the much maligned Mr. Mulroney. was a leader on in the Rio Environmental Conference, and the Chrétien government and Stéphane Dion played the same role. That meant that we had a time, because we were so engaged, we had the credibility to sit down and say, we believe in achieving these goals, but we have these unusual problems here. And I think, if anything, the sort of stepping away from that international consensus on environment has made it more difficult for us to make the case that there are exceptional challenges here. Now, it also indicates, I think, less willingness than we need to address the problems at home, but that's a different issue.
Peacekeeping is something that I know is very, very close to your heart, and very important initiatives. Peacekeeping in the 1990s, 80s, and 90s, Canada was first in the world, and not just for small, I mean, not just, you know, the smaller things that were going on, but looking at Bosnia, looking at all of Yugoslavia, we're looking at Africa, Congo, huge contribution. We're now in the low 50s of contribution. We're almost the bottom of the heap of countries contributing to peacekeeping. What have we lost?
Oh, I think we've lost, I think it contributes to a loss of our standing. What's interesting is why that happened, I think. Part of it was that we were very active peacekeepers at a time when the then government, the Chrétien government largely, was spending less on military spending than we should have been. And I won't say it was a cover to be active in peacekeeping, but it certainly created a sense among people who were serious about military preparedness, as I am, and as a number of other people are, to believe that we were underfunding, and that our priorities were distorted by the focus on peacekeeping. The second thing that happened is that the nature of peacekeeping has changed. It's a quite complicated problem now. A lot of the nations that contribute peacekeepers are doing that because there is, in effect, financial support for them doing it. So there is that internal change as well. But we withdrew far too fast and far too completely. And other countries who had similar dilemmas to ours did not retreat. And what they are doing is sending in experts who can make ordinary forces extraordinary, because they've learned to do that in their own military forces. The Italians are doing that, others are doing that. We should be doing that, but we're not. We have stepped back from peacekeeping generally, almost ideologically. And well, I think that there is a view among some members of the government that peacekeeping is too soft, that we should not be doing that. We should be doing the hard fighting work of a military. I think, by the way, that's not what the military thinks. I mean, one of the things that's quite interesting about most militaries, but certainly the Canadian military, is that there is a very serious focus now upon peace building, upon conflict avoidance. People who were once taught simply how to fight are now taught how to try to prevent fighting. That's developing within military personnel. But the government itself, I think, regards peacekeeping as one of those places where from which it doesn't come and to which it doesn't want to go.
But when we look back at Bosnia and the Mulroney government and the decisions made there, very bold. The CF-18s were on the runway ready to go before anybody, and then your government had to slow down and wait for Bill Clinton to catch up with the thinking of the time. Isn't that the same thing as we're seeing with Stephen Harper going into Afghanistan, or going south in Afghanistan to Kandahar?
You see, I think you can do two things at once. I think the issue about soft power is not that we should be doing it instead of hard power. I think that each draws strength from the other. And what has happened here is that the government of Canada, for complex reasons, has drawn back from its soft power role, of which peacekeeping would be a part, and is emphasizing much more the hard power role. And I think that costs our capacity in hard power, as well as being imbalanced.
Any chance that you're wrong about this?
Oh, sure. Yes. Yes.
That maybe Stephen Harper has captured some kind of a zeitgeist, that there is a Canada of the 21st century that wants an aggressive military, that eschews the role of government in our lives, that looks to make people wealthy with our natural resources, with the extraction of stuff out of the ground, and doesn't go along with the flow. Is
Yes.
it possible that that's a Canada that many people would like to follow?
I think he believes that it is, or that it should be, and I think that he is using his capacity as the head of a government to try to encourage those tendencies in the country. And I don't. Some of the tendencies you described, I wouldn't approve of, but many of them I would. I have no concerns at all about an entrepreneurial society or any of these kinds of things. I certainly believe we need to have a strong military. But I think we are more than that. We are more than just one thing. And I think that there has been far too narrow a focus on this. Go ahead.
No, what's interesting about this definition of a new Canada, and Stephen Harper said before 2006 that he wanted to write a new Canadian narrative. And he wanted it to be from the point of view of other heroes that you embrace, John Diefenbaker, John A. Macdonald, and well, of course we throw in the War of 1812 into this, but there is a view, a narrative that he wants to write. And if he's given enough time, he believes that Canadians will sign on to that narrative.
That's very important, and it's true. There is a narrative he wants to write. He kept it fairly well to himself, apart from a couple of speeches of the kind you've referred to, but there is a narrative he wants to write. And I think the question is that a narrative that Canadians find either comfortable or consistent with what we either have been or want to be? And I guess part of my argument in this book is that it's not consistent with the narrative that I think the country should be following. I'm not even sure.
How would you
Yes.
define his narrative, and then tell me your narrative, please?
I think his narrative is an emphasis upon strength in a quite virile sort of way, and in a number of manifestations. And I think it would be less open to people who are not as strong as others. It would, some of his attitudes before he was elected Prime Minister with regard to Atlantic Canada, for example, indicate there is not the same sympathy that there had been traditionally, I underline traditionally, for some of the poorer areas of the country. I think it is a sort of a virile male strength. And I think the country, my own narrative, is much broader than that. I think we are, the diversity we celebrate is not simply a cultural or a linguistic diversity. We respect the diversity of attitudes of people, and we try to encourage that where we find it. We've done that for a long, long time. I think they are different narratives. Mine has the disadvantage or advantage of having been the traditional narrative. His will attract a lot of attention. I think there are a lot of people who look at government and see constraint. There was a generation in Canada that looked at government and saw either equality or saw opportunity, the chance to achieve opportunity for others. I don't think that's the attitude that Mr. Harper takes. I should say when I'm speaking to Mr. Harper, I certainly don't include all of his ministers or all of his party. I think that it's a broader party. If it were allowed to act true to nature, it would be a broader party than it is under his constraints. But nonetheless, I think that's his narrative. And my narrative, I would describe as being a much broader. I suppose the word has to be used, more generous narrative.
One of the areas that was dear to your heart, and I know it was also to your wife, Maureen McTeer, it was to see Canada take a lead role in poverty reduction here and abroad. What's happened to that agenda?
It's not a priority agenda. The problems in poverty here are significant. If you take a look again at some of the statistics in the book, our international comparisons, the reason we fall back in some of those comparisons is because we are not dealing with significant poverty issues, including not simply including the serious continuing problem of Aboriginal poverty, but youth poverty and others. So it has not been a priority for.
What about
for
the
this
maternal
government.
health initiative that Stephen Harper launched?
Well, Maureen, are you listening to
Yeah,
this?
I was actually looking for Maureen as well.
I'm not going to respond to that here with the microphones on. But it's a maternal health initiative that will not deal with birth control. And that's a pretty diluted maternal health initiative. Now, to his credit, to the Prime Minister's credit, he has joined with the the President of Tanzania, and they are leading a United Nations effort on that. But they are leading it within narrow confines. And those confines, again, reflect a view that I think does not reflect either the Canadian interest or probably the Canadian consensus.
You said in the book that Stephen Harper has more personal power than any prime minister you've ever known. What are the consequences of that?
I'm tempted to say we're seeing some of the consequences. No, I mean, I'm quite troubled by what happened in the Senate because it seems to me to be an attempt to crack down, to fundamentally change an institution. And the risk, it seems to me, having nothing to do with the three senators who really were found guilty without all the evidence being adduced. Put that to the side. It's a terrible precedent. And the precedent could be used to limit the independence of the Senate in the future. And the Senate, for all its faults, was never created to be dependent. It was created to have another perspective. But I think that attitude, unfortunately, is part of the government's approach today.
I am speaking with the Right Honourable Joe Clark, former Prime Minister of Canada, about his new book, How We Lead Canada in a Century of Change. We're at the Appel Salon at the Toronto Reference Library. I will now ask if people want to ask questions. We have about 10 minutes to do so, and I'll tell you right off the top that anyone who's seen me do anything before, you know that I am ruthless about speeches and preambles, so come to your questions quickly. I know there's a lot of people who want to take part in this. So I will begin with this very eager woman in the front.
I see that you're very supportive of the peacekeeping, which I have been as well. But the current government support for military glory, I feel, and I'm going to ask your opinion about, is not supportive of our wounded veterans who then come home. So if there's money for armor and fighting, why is there not money to support people who are injured in our service?
Obviously there should be. I'm not here to defend the government's policy. I've noticed the same anomaly.
All right, sir.
Hey, as an elder statesman here in Canada...
Are you speaking of me or of you?
I'm speaking of you. I'm speaking of you. I have a lot of respect for you.
Thank you.
As an elder statesman of Canada, I'd like to get your viewpoint on the following, and that is there's a political and economic virus that has attacked all the leadership throughout the world, whether it's in the European Union, like Greece or Portugal or Spain, and what's going on there in their economies, and I blame the leadership. And then when you come over to North America, you have like the United States of America with $217 trillion in debt. You've got the province of Ontario with $250 billion of debt. You've got the city of Toronto with, God knows, $2 billion of debt. My question is simply to you is this. What do we have to do to get the kind of leadership that we deserve and we want? We want leadership that has ethics. We want leadership that has a vision. We want leadership that treats our taxpayers' dollars in a very deferential way, not in the frivolous manner in which expenditures are being made in a thoughtless, meaningless way, day in, day out. They reinforce the failures of the past, and they keep on doing that. So my question is simply, what would you do to bring better leadership to play, whether in Canada or elsewhere?
Two comments. First of all, it is much more difficult to lead in this age than it was before because so much more is known. There are so many more factors that you have to take account of. Every single transgression by anybody suddenly becomes a headline and the defining headline. My real worry about leadership is not the quality of people we have now, but our capacity to attract quality in the future. And that's just, it's a reality. It's a reality everywhere. Secondly, there's no easy answer to the question as to what develops leadership. One thing that is necessary is an active citizenry. People who are going to hold people to account not for their personal transgressions, but for their policies, and encourage and become active in discussion and debate. And instead, what we're seeing not only in Canada, but in very many places, are two phenomena that are dangerous. One is a decline in voter participation. The other is the growth of groups that are dominating politics and are very far over on one extreme or another. When I look at Western Europe, I'm quite troubled by the degree of nativist parties that have developed in many parts of Europe, including in places like the Nordic countries that used to be in the vanguard of what could be called progressive government. So the world is more complicated. People who should be involved in serious debate about public affairs are dropping back. Potential candidates who should be offering are finding reasons, or their families are finding reasons why they would not do that. There's no magic solution. And the very point you made in your preface about this not being simply a Canadian problem is really at the root of what we're dealing with. It's a broad cultural problem. I don't say this facetiously. I do a lot of work with democracy development in the developing world, and I've come to the conclusion that there are many developing countries that are better at these things than we are. We have to learn some modesty about many of our own processes here and be prepared to change them, but a critical element in all of that is citizen involvement.
Okay,
Thank you.
Next question, please.
Well, it's funny, but I was going to say ditto to the previous question, that it would seem that any great analysis that could be taking place on the government of Canada should be also echoed by analysis of the American and European governments. But if I even get more specific than that, we're not only just looking at the collapse of leadership in the world, but
So what's your question?
well, the thing is have you examined the idea of the collapse of the American government in the next couple of years with the debt crisis? Because the government stalemated, and if they've closed down the government once, they probably will do it again, and there's going to be some great consequences there. And I think that Mr. Harper has taken some bold steps to bring us to the European Union with the free trade agreement after 5 years of haggling, and that may be where we should be looking at analysis of democracy and so on, and diversifying the Canadian ethic
Okay,
in the
we'll
future.
get Mr. Clark to respond. Thank you.
Two quick responses. One, while I want to see more of the details, I think that the trade agreement with Europe is a good thing. And it's particularly notable, and thank you for making the point, with the Harper government, because they did not have a great interest in trade when they came to office. And they have learned one, and they've acquired one, and this seems to be a deal that is probably a very productive deal.
Especially if the Americans collapse.
Well, I mean, first of all, I tend to be an optimist about the Americans. I get as frustrated as anybody else, but they are the most resilient people I've ever seen. And Lord knows they need resilience now. But I don't have a magic answer to leadership issues.
Thank you. I'll get, sir, there's a lot of people behind you, sir. Thank you. There's people behind you. I'll get the woman behind you. Thank you.
I just want to say, first of all, congratulations on your book and for what a great turnout tonight. But also, I have a question about where do you think we should be going from here? Like, where do you think Canada should be going in terms of its foreign policy? Are there sort of 3 areas or maybe 4 points in terms of objective that you think that Canada should be making on the world stage today? Because you've talked considerably about how we've changed and about the differences and the changes that you've seen over time. But if you were to look at maybe 2 or 3 things in terms of where to the future, where do you think that Canada should be going now in terms of our foreign policy, and where should we be in the world, on the world stage?
Thank you very much for that, because that's really the reason I wrote the book. And two quick things. One, I think we should be trying to reinvigorate multilateral systems as much as we could, starting with the United Nations, but also other things. It is the only way the world is going to work. We have credentials. I think we can make a difference there. Secondly, I think one of the startling phenomena in the last 20 years has been the power and the influence of actors in the world that are not states, that are not governments. They can be organizations like Greenpeace. They can be the International Red Cross that can go into places where nobody else can. When you take a look at the number of people who are not only involved in non-state actors, but also the difference those non-state actors can make on the ground in conflict areas, We need to be doing more of, please don't tell anybody in my former party that I said this, we have to be doing more of what Lloyd Axworthy did when he brought NGOs and the Government of Canada together when he brought NGOs in to the orbit of government. I call it marrying mandate of governments with the imagination of NGOs to accomplish something that hadn't been done before. He did it on landmines. The government he was part of did it on the International Criminal Court. There is a range of other issues where Canada could intervene on those questions. One last thing on this. I'm putting forward some proposals in the book. You asked me earlier, what if I'm wrong? I can certainly be wrong on some of these issues. And one of the things I hope will happen is that some of the proposals I'm putting forward in the book will outlast Christmas and will be picked up by universities and others to generate specific discussion. What is the next landmines issue? What kind of cooperation could work with NGOs? How do you make NGOs cooperate with anybody, let alone governments? What are the soft power implications and alternatives open to Canada? What is the proportion of spending today on defense and security as against diplomacy and development? And why is it that way, and how can it be balanced? I need a lot of help on these things, and there is a sense in which this book is an invitation to others, many of them much more expert than I, a lot of them much more contemporary than I, to take a look at these issues.
Thank you. Very good question. And next one.
I'd like to hear more of your opinions about the environment. It seems to me that we're at a critical time now worldwide with air pollution, global warming, and disappearance of species at risk. And I think from what I've seen, the Harper government has degraded Canada's position on all these things. So what do you propose?
I'm no longer in the business of proposing things to electorates, but I think that there is a growing and serious problem. There's a growing problem in the environment, objectively. It's being made more serious by governments, by the fact that governments are reluctant to address that issue. Nonetheless, there is some important progress being made, sometimes from unexpected sources. I mean, some of the corporate social responsibility actions of some companies. Some of the attitudes, dare I say this as an Albertan, of some of the oil companies looking seriously at what might happen with the oil sands in Alberta are quite creative, and people are looking at things. Under the gun, at least under the gun, maybe because they believe in it, the government of Alberta is taking a quite proactive position on environmental issues. We know one of the reasons they're doing it is that there is a threat to a matter they consider very important, but nonetheless, whatever the motive, the reality is that they are looking at these issues more seriously. So I think what we have to do is try to encourage those aspects where they are happening. We have to take the environmental issue out of the realm of zeal and make it an issue that is going to be critically important to simple survival.
Thank you very much for that question. Sir.
Joe, if I may.
Please. Everybody else does.
Oh, good.
I called you Mr. Clark.
My question is very short. Have you been interviewed by your daughter on CPAC?
I have.
Oh, you have?
I have, along with the other former prime ministers. And if you haven't seen it, you should.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I think she's absolutely terrific.
She's her mother's daughter.
Well,
Yeah.
It's her birthday?
And it's her birthday. And it's her birthday. That's right.
oh, really?
Lovely.
Well, many happy returns to
Thank you.
Thank you.
Caroline, isn't it? In any case, I just wondered how you get a copy of that interview.
If you'll email CPAC, the Canadian Parliamentary...
And that's all there is to it?
I think so, yeah.
Sir, we have just a few more minutes left, and I want to get these
Sorry.
last people. Thank you very much.
Anyway, congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about your comment about there won't be any superpowers in the future and whether or not that's a good thing?
Whether it's a good thing or not, I think it's inevitable. The Chinese are going to be a significant power. The Americans are going to be a significant power. But I guess I'm putting that context in my experience at the end of the Cold War, where I was intimately involved. In fact, I chaired the first meeting of the Warsaw Pact and NATO foreign ministers. It happened to be in Canada. I happened to be the foreign minister, so I chaired it. But we're not going to have a period again when a Soviet Union can, in effect, control as closely as it did the international policy of the then satellite countries. The United States was much more gentle about the leadership it showed, and it was genuine leadership, and there was genuine discussion. But there was never much doubt on most issues. The Strategic Defense Initiative, I guess, was an exception. There was never much doubt that the American preference, one way or another, was going to manifest. That's an indication of what superpowers do. The world isn't like that anymore. First of all, the threat that drove sides together in the Cold War is the threats we face are not another alliance. They're a different kind of threat. And in fact, they need much more imagination in looking at them. But nonetheless, there are so many more players now, many of which are outside the realm of states, that it's not going to be possible for a China or a United States or anyone else to play the role that was played in the past by the former Soviet Union and the US.
Thank you very much. And the final question.
Mr. Clark, you are obviously very proud of your fight against apartheid in South Africa. But what about the apartheid in Canada? And I'm referring to the native people, of course.
Thank you.
It is it's not simply a scar on Canada, it's a potentially very dangerous issue because the Aboriginal youth are the fastest growing cohort, population cohort in Canada by far. And if they are raised in a situation where not only are they denied the daily life advantages, the opportunities, the health that other Canadians are, but also if they have a sense of being victims in their own country, that is going to become an explosive situation. We were very lucky that Idle No More was formed by women, not by men, who were who were committed to nonviolence. And one of the things that was interesting about Idle No More, it didn't last a long time, but it drew a lot of young people who were on the edge, Aboriginal young people, who were on the edge of tipping in the wrong direction. And there simply has to be a response to that. By the way, if any of you has an opportunity to attend the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings, you should do that. I'm an honorary witness of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which means I have gone to hear the stories of some of the people who were abused, and we all read about them, but I'll tell you there is no equivalent to sitting in the room and listening to a woman who's now in her 60s, whose life was ruined, whose children's life was ruined, whose grandchildren's life were ruined by that experience. And that, now the truth side of that is being told. The Commission is doing a good job, I think. The reconciliation side has not begun. And that's an obligation that I think rests on all of us. I think there's a very strong interest on the part of Aboriginal leaders. I'm part of an informal group that includes two former national chiefs, both of whom used to fight with one another when they were both in active life, as I then was. But there is a growing concern about things needing to be done. And among other things, if you have neighbors who don't take this issue seriously, get some videos of the hearings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and invite your neighbors in to hear what has happened in our country to people who are our fellow citizens and then discuss what might be done about that. It's not simple, but here's what really worries me about this issue. I was, for my sins, the Minister of Constitutional Affairs back a long time ago. And one of the things I noticed, because Aboriginal issues were on our agenda, I have to say they were on our agenda then because they'd been off our agenda before, and we paid a price for that. One of the things that struck me was that people who had no particular knowledge of Aboriginal issues were suddenly concerned about it. I'll never forget a meeting of the the Federation of Ontario Municipalities, whatever its formal name is. When a woman whose life had been in public life, civic public life, came up to me and said, "Mr. Clark, I've never met an Aboriginal person, may I?" And I said, "Of course we can do that." But it struck me, here was a person very active in the civic life of Ontario who had never met an Aboriginal person, knew nothing about these issues directly. There was that high degree of interest then. I think that degree of interest is lower now. And I think that it's up to all of us to try to ensure that it gets up to levels from which action might ensue.
Thank you for the question. Mr. Clark?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.